My son-in-law mocked my accent until he learned who owned his company. The conference room smelled like leather and fear. I sat at the head of the long table, hands folded on the polished walnut surface, watching my son-in-law's face drain of color as the regional director read the organizational chart aloud. When she reached the parent company's name, Marcus stopped breathing for a moment. His eyes found mine across 12 feet of expensive wood, and I saw recognition arrive like a slow-motion collision. The same mouth that had spent 3 years pronouncing my name wrong, always with that little smirk, now hung slightly open. I did not smile. I did not speak. I simply held his gaze until he looked away, and in that silence, everything between us was rewritten. That meeting was still 2 weeks ahead, but the story begins much earlier, in smaller rooms at quieter tables. I learned English in night classes while working double shifts at a machining plant 40 years ago. My accent never left. The vowels still land wrong sometimes, and certain consonant clusters refuse to cooperate no matter how many times I practice them in the mirror. I stopped trying to hide it decades ago. My voice carries the weight of where I came from, and I've never been ashamed of that. But I learned early to watch how people react when I speak. Some listen harder, some glance away, and some, like Marcus, hear the accent before they hear the words. He came into our lives 5 years ago at a company holiday party. My daughter Elena brought him to meet us the following weekend. He wore pressed khakis and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to show tanned forearms. His handshake was firm, and he looked me in the eye when he introduced himself, which I appreciated. My wife set out coffee and pastries, and we spent an hour in the living room talking about his work in pharmaceutical sales, his college years, his plans. He asked polite questions about my background, and when I explained that I had come to the country with very little and built a small business over the years, he nodded and said all the right things. I noticed the first slip 3 weeks later at dinner. I mispronounced the name of a restaurant Elena had suggested, transposing 2 syllables. Marcus corrected me with a smile, but the correction lingered a beat too long. He repeated the correct pronunciation slowly, as if instructing a child. Elena laughed it off, but I saw the flicker of discomfort cross her face. I said nothing. They married the following spring in a small ceremony at a vineyard upstate. I walked Elena down the aisle and shook Marcus's hand at the altar. He thanked me in his toast for raising such an incredible woman, and his words were gracious. My wife cried. I felt the usual mixture of pride and loss that comes with watching your child begin a separate life. The evening was beautiful. I had no reason yet to doubt him. The pattern emerged slowly. At first it was easy to dismiss as thoughtlessness. A joke about my pronunciation at Thanksgiving dinner. A comment about how certain words sounded when I said them, delivered with a grin that was meant to soften the edge. Elena would touch his arm and say his name in that tone spouses use when they want their partner to dial it back. He would apologize, but the apologies felt performative, designed to satisfy form rather than express regret. I am not a man who demands deference. I worked for everything I have, and I have never believed that respect is owed simply because of age or position. But respect can be observed in small gestures, in whether someone listens when you speak or waits for you to finish a thought before interrupting. Marcus rarely waited. He had a habit of finishing my sentences when I paused to find a word, filling the silence with his own assumptions. Sometimes he was right, often he was not. Either way, the interruption carried the same message. My wife noticed before I said anything. One Sunday afternoon, after Marcus and Elena had left following lunch, she stood at the sink washing dishes and said quietly that Marcus seemed to think very highly of himself. I dried a plate and asked what she meant. She handed me another dish and said he talked over me, that he seemed to think I needed help expressing simple ideas. I set the plate down and looked at her. She met my eyes and said she did not like the way he treated me, but that Elena seemed happy and we should not interfere unless it became worse. I agreed, but something settled into place that afternoon. I began to pay closer attention. The mocking became less subtle. At a family gathering, Marcus did an impression of me ordering food at a restaurant, exaggerating the vowel sounds and adding a stutter I do not have. The table went quiet for a moment, then someone laughed nervously, and the conversation moved on. Elena pulled him aside afterward, and I heard her raised voice from the next room. But when they returned, Marcus offered only a shrug and said he was just kidding around. I told Elena it was fine, that I was not offended, because I did not want to put her in the position of choosing sides. But I was offended. More than that, I was disappointed. I had thought better of him. I spent 35 years building a business from nothing. I started with a single contract machining parts for a local manufacturer working out of a rented garage. I learned the trade through apprenticeship, nights and weekends, while holding down a day job to keep food on the table. My hands still carry the scars from those early years, thin white lines across the knuckles and a divot in my left thumb where a slipped blade took a piece of flesh I never got back. The work was hard, but it was mine. I reinvested every dollar, hired carefully, and built relationships with clients who valued precision and reliability. Over time, the garage became a shop, the shop became a facility, and the facility became the foundation for something larger. When manufacturing started moving overseas, I saw the writing on the wall. I sold the business for a fair price and took the proceeds into investment partnerships with men I had known for decades. We pooled resources and bought equity stakes in companies that showed promise. Nothing glamorous. Mid-sized firms in logistics, medical supplies, light manufacturing, software infrastructure. We stayed quiet. We did not chase headlines or ego. We built portfolios that generated steady returns, and we diversified carefully across industries and geographies. I became a silent partner in more than 20 companies over the next 15 years. My name appeared on documents that lawyers and accountants read, but not on websites or press releases. I preferred it that way. Marcus knew I had done well. He knew I was comfortable, but I never discussed the details, and he never asked. To him, I was Elena's father, a retired machinist, with an accent who talked too much about the old country and did not understand how the modern world worked. He made that clear in small ways. When I offered advice about saving or investing, he would nod politely and then ignore it. When I suggested a contact who might help him with a career move, he thanked me and never followed up. He had his own network, his own ideas. I was a relic from a different era, and my input was quaint at best. I could have corrected his assumptions. I could have shown him documents or explained the structure of the partnerships, but I saw no reason to. A man who respects you does not need a portfolio to justify courtesy, and a man who does not respect you will not change his mind because you have money. So I stayed quiet and watched. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening in late September. Elena called and asked if we could watch their son, our grandson, while she attended a work event. Marcus was traveling, and her usual sitter had canceled. We agreed immediately. My wife and I adore the boy. He's 4 years old, curious and bright, with Elena's eyes and a laugh that fills a room. We picked him up after preschool and brought him back to our house. He wanted to help me in the garden, so we spent an hour pulling weeds and talking about bugs. My wife made his favorite dinner. We read him stories before bed, and he fell asleep holding a stuffed rabbit that had once belonged to his mother. Elena picked him up the next morning before work. She looked tired but grateful. We stood in the driveway talking while the boy buckled himself into his car seat. She thanked us again, and then hesitated, glancing back toward the house. I asked if something was wrong. She shook her head and said Marcus had been under a lot of stress at work. There were rumors of a merger, and he was worried about his position. She asked if I could be patient with him, that he did not mean the things he said when he was anxious. I told her I understood, and she hugged me before driving away. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table with my coffee. My wife asked what Elena had said. I repeated the conversation. She was quiet for a moment, then said Marcus was a grown man and should know better than to take his stress out on family. I agreed, but I also felt a flicker of sympathy. I remembered what it was like to worry about money, to feel the ground shift under your feet when circumstances changed, so I decided to let it go. I would give him space, avoid conflict, and hope the stress passed. That resolution lasted 3 days. Elena invited us to dinner at their house on Friday. It was a warm evening, and we ate on the patio while the boy played in the yard. The conversation was pleasant until Marcus started talking about work. He mentioned the merger again, explaining that his company was being acquired by a larger conglomerate. He did not know much about the new ownership, but he was confident he would come out ahead. He was one of the top sales reps in the region, and they would be foolish to let him go. He said this with the kind of certainty that comes from never having been truly tested. I asked a few questions about the structure of the deal. He waved them off, saying it was complicated and still being finalized. Then he added, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that I probably would not understand the corporate side of things anyway. It was a different world from the kind of work I had done. My wife's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Elena said his name sharply. Marcus raised his hands in mock surrender and said he was only joking, but the damage was done. I finished my meal in silence. We left an hour later. Elena walked us to the car and apologized quietly. I told her it was fine, but we both knew it was not. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in bed thinking about the name of the company Marcus had mentioned. I knew it. I knew it because 18 months earlier, my investment group had taken a controlling interest in the parent corporation as part of a leveraged buyout. We held 62% of the equity through a series of shell entities and trusts. The operational team ran the day-to-day business, but major decisions came through our quarterly meetings. I had signed off on the merger Marcus was worried about. I had reviewed the financials and the integration plan. I knew exactly what was happening, and I knew that the regional leadership would be reshuffled as part of the consolidation. I got up before dawn and went into my study. I pulled the files from the locked cabinet where I keep business records. I found the organizational chart and traced the chain of ownership from the parent company down through the divisions. Marcus worked for a regional subsidiary 3 levels below the top. His name was not on any of the documents, but his division was. I made a note of his title and location, then cross-referenced it against the integration plan. His team was being absorbed into a larger unit. There would be redundancies. Some positions would be eliminated. Others would be reassigned. I did not know yet whether Marcus would survive the cut, but I knew who would make that decision, and I knew that person reported to me. I sat back in my chair and looked out the window at the garden. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber. I thought about what my wife had said, that we should not interfere unless things became worse. I thought about Elena, caught in the middle, trying to manage her husband's ego and her father's dignity. I thought about my grandson, who would grow up watching how the men in his life treated each other. I decided I would not interfere with Marcus's job. That would be petty, and it would hurt Elena. But I would not hide the truth either. If the merger brought us into the same room, so be it. He would learn what he should have known from the beginning, which is that respect is not a favor you grant based on someone's accent or appearance. It is a baseline courtesy you extend until given a reason to withdraw it. I spent the next week making quiet inquiries. I called the lead partner in our investment group and asked about the timeline for the merger. He said the announcement would be made internally within 10 days, followed by a regional leadership meeting to discuss integration. I asked if I needed to attend. He said it was not necessary, but the team would appreciate a presence from ownership, especially given the scope of the changes. I told him I would be there. I did not mention any of this to my wife or Elena. There was no point in raising questions until I knew how the situation would unfold, but I prepared. I reviewed the files again, memorized the names of the key players, and made sure I understood the strategic rationale behind every decision. If Marcus was going to see me in that room, I wanted to be unshakable. The announcement came on a Wednesday morning. Elena called that afternoon, her voice tight. She said Marcus had just learned about the merger and was furious. He had expected to be briefed earlier, and he felt blindsided. He was already talking about looking for another job, convinced that the new ownership would not appreciate his contributions. She sounded exhausted. I asked if there was anything I could do. She said no, but thanked me for asking. I hung up and sat with the weight of what was coming. I knew Marcus would attend the regional meeting. I knew he would see me there. I knew the moment would redefine everything. But I did not know exactly how it would play. I could only control my own presence, my own composure. The rest would unfold as it would. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the regional headquarters downtown. I dressed carefully that morning. A dark suit, white shirt, simple tie. My wife asked if I had a business meeting. I said yes, and she nodded without pressing for details. She had learned over the years that I did not always discuss work, and she trusted me to manage my own affairs. I arrived early and met with the leadership team in a smaller conference room before the larger meeting. The regional director, a sharp woman in her 50s named Catherine, walked me through the agenda. She asked if I wanted to say anything during the presentation. I said I would prefer to observe unless questions were directed to me specifically. She nodded and said that was fine, but that my presence would send a message about ownership's engagement. I told her I understood. The larger meeting began at 10. About 30 people filed into the conference room, a mix of managers and senior sales staff. Marcus was among them. He took a seat near the middle of the table, nodding to a few colleagues but looking distracted. He did not see me at first. I was seated at the far end, partially obscured by the angle of the room. I watched him settle in, pulling out a notebook and uncapping a pen. He glanced at his phone once, then set it face down on the table. Catherine called the meeting to order and began the presentation. She covered the strategic rationale for the merger, the timeline for integration, and the changes to the reporting structure. She projected an organizational chart on the screen behind her. The parent company's name was at the top, followed by a cascade of subsidiaries and divisions. About halfway through, she paused and gestured toward me. She said she wanted to introduce a representative from the ownership group who had been instrumental in structuring the deal and who would remain involved in oversight going forward. She said my name. I saw Marcus's head turn. His eyes scanned the room, then locked on me. The recognition was instant. His face went through a series of changes, confusion giving way to disbelief, then something close to panic. I held his gaze, my expression neutral, and inclined my head slightly in acknowledgement. I did not smile. I did not speak. I simply let the moment exist. Catherine continued talking, but I doubt Marcus heard another word. He stared at me for a long moment, then looked down at his notebook. His hand, which had been holding the pen, was trembling slightly. I shifted my attention back to Catherine and listened as she outlined the next steps. The room settled into a rhythm of questions and answers. A few people directed questions to me about the long-term vision for the company. I answered them clearly, my accent present, but my meaning unmistakable. No one seemed confused. The meeting ended an hour later. People began filing out, stopping to shake hands and exchange brief words. Marcus stayed in his seat. I watched him from across the room, waiting to see if he would approach. He finally stood, gathered his things, and started toward the door. Then he stopped, turned, and walked over to where I stood near the window. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. He said he had not known. His voice was quiet, almost hoarse. I waited. He said he had not. Realized I was involved in the company. I nodded and said there was no reason he would have known. I kept my tone even, free of edge or satisfaction. He asked if Elena knew. I said no, that I had not discussed business matters with her. He nodded slowly, processing that. We stood in silence for a moment. Then he said he had been under a lot of stress and he was sorry if he had ever been disrespectful. The apology was clumsy, clearly improvised, but it was the first one that felt like it might be genuine. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about all the small humiliations, the jokes at my expense, the casual dismissals. I thought about Elena and my grandson. I thought about what kind of man I wanted to be in this moment. I told him that respect was not something you parceled out based on someone's title or bank account. I said that I had never needed him to know about my business in order to treat me with basic courtesy, and that the fact that he felt he owed me an apology only now told me everything I needed to know. I said I would not interfere with his job, that his performance would determine his future with the company, but that going forward, he should think carefully about how he treated people when he thought they had nothing to offer him. His face flushed. He nodded, mumbled something about understanding, and walked out. I watched him go, feeling neither triumph nor anger, only a quiet sense of clarity. I drove home and found my wife in the kitchen preparing lunch. She asked how the meeting went. I told her it had gone well, that some things had been clarified. She looked at me for a long moment, then smiled slightly and said she was glad. I knew she suspected something, but she did not press. She has always understood when to let silence do the work. Elena called that evening. Her voice was strained. She said Marcus had come home from the meeting upset that he had told her about seeing me there. She asked why I had not mentioned I was involved in his company. I said I had not known he worked there until recently, and that by the time I realized the connection, the merger was already in motion. I told her I had not interfered, and I would not. She was quiet for a moment, then said, Marcus felt humiliated. I said I understood, but that humiliation was a choice. I had not done anything to him. I had simply existed in a space he had not expected me to occupy. She sighed and said she wished things were simpler. I told her I did too. We talked for a few more minutes, skirting around the real issue, then said goodnight. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my study, thinking about the distance between what we hope people will be and what they reveal themselves to be. The weeks that followed were awkward. Marcus stopped attending family dinners. Elena made excuses, saying he was busy with work, but we all knew the real reason. My wife suggested giving him space, and I agreed. I had no desire to force a confrontation or demand. Reconciliation. Time would either soften his embarrassment or it would not. Either way, it was his choice to make. The integration proceeded smoothly. Marcus kept his job, which I learned through a follow-up call with Catherine. She said he was competent, if a bit arrogant, but that his numbers were solid. I thanked her for the update and asked her not to mention my interest. She agreed. I wanted him to succeed or fail on his own merits without any shadow of favoritism or sabotage. 2 months later, Elena called and asked if we could come to dinner. She said Marcus wanted to talk. My wife and I drove over on a Saturday evening. Marcus answered the door and shook my hand, his grip firm but his eyes avoiding mine. We sat in the living room while Elena brought out drinks. The boy ran in and climbed onto my lap, chattering about a fort he had built in the backyard. I listened, grateful for the distraction, while Marcus sat across from me and stared at his hands. Eventually, Elena took the boy upstairs for his bath, and we were left alone. Marcus cleared his throat and said he owed me a real apology. He said he had spent the last 2 months thinking about how he had treated me, and that he was ashamed. He said he had grown up believing that success was about being the smartest person in the room, and that he had mistaken confidence for competence. He said he had judged me based on how I sounded rather than what I had accomplished, and that he knew now how wrong that was. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked if he understood why I had not told him about my involvement in the company. He nodded and said he thought so. I said I had wanted him to respect me because I was his wife's father and his son's grandfather, not because I had money or power. I said that respect rooted in fear or obligation was not respect at all. He nodded again, and this time, he met my eyes. I told him that I accepted his apology, but that trust was rebuilt through actions, not words. I said I would be watching how he treated not just me, but everyone around him. I said that if he wanted to be the kind of man his son looked up to, he needed to start practicing humility now, while the boy was still young enough to learn from his example. Marcus said he understood. We shook hands again, and this time it felt different. Not warm, but honest. Elena came back downstairs with the boy, and we ate dinner together. The conversation was cautious but civil. Marcus asked me a few questions about the early years of my business, and he listened when I answered. He did not interrupt. He did not finish my sentences. When I mispronounced a word, he did not correct me. It was a small thing, but I noticed. Over the following months, things improved slowly. Marcus started attending family gatherings again. He still carried himself with a certain confidence, but it was tempered now by something closer to humility. He began asking my advice on financial decisions, and when I offered suggestions, he followed up. He sent me thank you notes after dinners, brief but sincere. My wife said she saw a change in him, and I agreed. I do not know if the change will last. People have a way of reverting to old patterns when the pressure of scrutiny lifts. But I choose to believe that the lesson took root, at least partially. I choose to believe that my grandson will grow up watching a father who learned to respect people for who they are, not for what they can offer him. I still carry my accent. I still pause sometimes to find the right word, but I no longer wonder whether people are listening. I know who I am, and I know what I have built. The rest is just noise. On a Sunday afternoon last month, Marcus and Elena brought the boy over to help me plant bulbs for the spring. We worked side by side in the garden, our hands dark with soil, while my wife watched from the porch with a cup of tea. The boy asked questions about tulips and daffodils, and I answered them as best I could. Marcus listened, adding a comment here and there, but mostly he just worked quietly beside us. At one point, the boy looked up at me and said my name, getting the pronunciation slightly wrong. Marcus started to correct him, then stopped. He glanced at me and I shook my head slightly. The boy said my name again, in his own way, and I smiled and said that was just fine. We finished planting as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. Marcus helped me gather the tools and we walked back to the house together. He thanked me for the afternoon, and I told him he was welcome any time. I do not need his gratitude. I do not need his fear. I only need him to see me, and to remember that the measure of a man is not in his title or his accent, but in how he treats the people who have no power to hurt him. That lesson, I think, is finally starting to take hold. Retry.